So we're just going to go through an entire example, performing all the pivots to get to the final solution and interpret the values of the numbers and what they mean. Again, let's just keep in mind that we're thinking of a very specific kind of problem, but in general this works for any problem. But for sake of imagination, we're imagining that our decision, x, y, and w, are three decisions we have to make. And let's imagine that we are trying to decide how many of each type of product we want to make to maximize, let's say, profit. So this is saying that each unit of x gives us $10 profit, each unit of y gives us $15 profit, each unit of w gives us $8 profit. However, the resources needed to make these products are limited. So we have 100 units of some resource that is needed to make both product X and product Y, and product X requires 10 units for each time we make a product X, we need 10 units of this resource. Each time we make a product Y, we need 8 units of this resource. So we're limited to how many units of X and Y we can make because we're limited by this resource. Same thing, we have some second resource that all the products need. In this case, 5 units for each X that we make, 10 units for each Y that we make, 8 units for each W we make. So we're limited again. And all our variables are non-negative. So we want to decide is how many of each of these products do we need to make to maximize profit and stay within the amount of available resources. And then when we're done, we want to know how many resources do we have left? Did we use them all? Do we have leftovers that we can then use for some other problem? So again, what we're really doing is we're translating the problem into a problem with not 3 variables in this case, but we're going to make it into a 5 variable problem. And the reason 5 is because we have 2 constraints here, 2 inequality constraints involving the variables. So each one of these, we're going to add a slack variable to it. And basically what I mean is we're going to say, let's add a new variable, S1. And the value of S1 is whatever it needs to be to make that equation true. So whatever we decide x and y to be, 10x plus 8y plus whatever S1 is has to equal 100. So the reason we do that is after we're done, if S1 is equal to 20, that tells us that we had 20 units of that resource still left over. And we do the same thing for the other equation. We add a slack variable S2, which makes that inequality into an equation. And basically by doing this, we haven't changed the problem. We've just added more variables and changed inequalities to equalities because mathematically speaking, equations are easier to work with and they're easier to interpret. And the algorithm we're using is using the idea of equations and balancing equations. So this is really the problem we're solving. And we translate it into a tableau. So again, we list all variables that we're going to be using. In this case, we have 5 of them. Each of them gets a column. Below those, we list each constraint, just the numbers. So we have 10x plus 8y plus S1 has to be equal to 100. You put in zeros wherever, if the variable's not in an equation, then it just has a 0 value, a 0 coefficient. Second constraint is 5x plus 10y plus 8w plus S2 is equal to 125. So just translating that equation. And then we take our objective function and to create a kind of bookkeeping row just to help us decide what to do and how to interpret the final answer. So we take our coefficients from our objective function and we put negatives in them. So we have negative 10 here for x, negative 15 for y, negative 8 for w, and then nothing for the slack variables because they don't contribute anything to the objective function at this point. So the value of our objective function is 0 because at this point we haven't decided to make anything. So x, y, and w are equal to 0, and the tableau tells us that because those columns are not pivoted. They're not in a pivot format where there's a 1 and a bunch of zeros. The columns that are pivoted are the slack variables at this point. They each have a 1 and then all zeros. So we keep track of those pivoted columns by putting the row label for the column that is basically non-zero. So where the 1 is, the first row, that's the S1 column. So I'm putting S1 there to tell me that at this point, S1 is equal to 100, meaning we haven't used any of the 100 available units of resource 1 because we haven't made anything. And then S2 is where the 1 is in the S2 column. The slack variable is here, so that's why we put S2. S2 is 125. So again, we haven't used any of the units of resource 2 yet. So we choose our pivot column from the objective row underneath our variables. Look for the leftmost negative number, that's this negative 10. That's our pivot column. Then our pivot row, we have to compute these ratios. The ratio of the number on the right side of the equation divided by the corresponding number in the pivot column. In this case, 10. And then we compute that, we can just drag it down. That's 25. So we pick the minimum for our pivot row. And again, the reason for that is you can explore this on your own. If you choose to use the pivot row as the second row here, and you perform the pivot, what you'll find is that over here you'll get some negative numbers. And what that's saying is the decision that that tableau is telling you to do is not possible because it's using more resources than you have. So after you pivot, if you get a negative over here, you did something wrong. All right, so we have that. Now all we need to do is copy just the important part. We don't need the ratios anymore. So we copy and make sure when you paste only the values. So do a special paste in Excel, the values. And again, depending on what version you're using, you see this copy box is not going away. That actually can cause some problems depending on what version you're using. So I like to just click in a cell, do a copy on the cell, and then hit escape, and then it goes away. So our goal now is to actually perform our pivot, which means this 10 we want to make into a 1. And then we want to use that 1 to define how we're going to manipulate the other equations so that the column in X becomes pivoted. So because the X column is our pivot column, once we're done with our pivot, X is going to replace the variable in our pivot row, which is S1. So I'm going to go ahead and change that immediately so that when I'm done, I can interpret these numbers. So I'm going to take this. All I want to do is say like this 10 is going to be equal to itself minus itself times the 1 from our, getting ahead of myself. I just want to divide it by itself because I'm making a 1. But I want to divide every number from that row by the same 10 that I just divided by. So you could have just said 10 if you wanted to, but by putting a $sign here, it says divide every number in this row by this same number 10 up here. So I should get a 0.8 next. Yep. And then I should get a 0 and a 0.1 and a 0. Yep. And I should get a 10 here. So again, you can always go back into the cells to check to make sure it's doing the right calculation. It says, yes, I took the number that was there, I'm dividing it by the number 10 from our pivot column. Yes, that's correct. Now I want to eliminate this 5. So I'm going to say it's going to be equal to what it is. It's 5 minus itself times the pivot row value of 1. And in this case, it's in the way. I can't click it. So I'm going to type in the cell address. It's D19. Again, I want to take this D14 is the value of my row. I want to subtract 5 times the value of the number in the pivot row. So I always want to keep this the same. That multiple of 5 is going to be the same across the entire row because you have to balance equations. You can't change part of an equation and then not change the rest of it the same way. So as we drag, we're subtracting 5. times the number from the pivot column or pivot row. So what I'm doing is this 10 is going to be 10 minus 5 times this 0.8. So I should get 6. There you go. So it's doing it correctly. I'm going to go all the way across. And then I do the same thing for the objective row because this is going to help us keep track of what to do next. So I need to replace the -10 by itself minus itself times the 1 from the pivot row. But again, I have to make sure I'm always fixing that multiple. There we have a pivoted, our first pivoted tableau. And now the interpretation is X is 10, so the decision that this tableau is telling us is to make 10 units of product X, but it's also saying to make no units of product Y or product W. It's also telling us that if we do make 10 units of product X, that we will have used all of the available resources from the first resource, which makes sense because if we use 10 units of X only, then 10 times 10 is 100, and we've used all the resources. This S2 is telling us that if we only make 10 units of X, we will still have 75 units of the original 125 units of the second resource that we needed. So it's possible we can still make more, or a different combination of products to get a higher value here, which is only 100. And the objective row is telling us that yes, we can make a better decision because there's negatives here. So we go to leftmost negative, that's now our pivot column. Pivot row, we have to redecide on what that's going to be. Do it the same way. Make our ratios, numbers on the right of our constraint equations, divided by the number from the pivot column. Do that for both. And we get a tie. So in this case, what do? If there's a tie for the minimum value? Well, generally speaking, you could probably pick whatever you want. However, there are cases where if you kind of randomly pick ties and you have 3 or more ties in a problem, that you could end up getting stuck in a loop where you're basically going around and keep going back and forth between 2 non-optimal solutions. However, there's an easy fix to it. Basically, always decide the same way. And what I like to do is just pick the highest one. Just like we picked the leftmost column with the negative, if there's a tie for the pivot row, just pick the highest one. All right, or pick the lowest one. I mean, either one will work. By doing that the same every time, it will avoid any loops, getting stuck in a loop. So we'll go ahead and pick the top one for a tiebreaker. All right. So again, we're just going to copy our tableau, paste it, and only paste the values. And now because our pivot column is the Y column, our pivot row is the X row, X is going to be swapped out for Y. So I'm going to do that first, so that when I'm done pivoting, everything's done. So now I need to make a 1 here and then zeros everywhere else. So in this case, we have to be careful because we're pivoting out the same variable we just pivoted in. So when we drag across to finish our equation, we still have to actually do something over here. But when there's a 0, when you have all zeros to the left, you can just drag to the right. But if you want to be safe and you don't want to think about cases and things like that, then always drag across the entire set of numbers. You might have to do 2 drags, drag left and right. But in the end, this is what we have to do. So in this case, we're going to divide. We say this is equal to that 0.8 divided by that 0.8. I have to put the $sign in, and then I have to drag it everywhere. So I have to drag it all the way to the right. I also have to drag to the left because this is not 0. If it were 0, I wouldn't have to, because dividing 0 by anything is still 0. In this case, I do need to drag this way as well. Now, I'm going to use the 1 to eliminate the 6. So I'm going to say 6 is equal to what it was 6 minus, go ahead and type the $sign in now, itself. Oh, I didn't like that. So that minus itself times, again, where's the 1? It's, my Excel's hiding it, but it's in column E, row 26. So E 26. But again, I have to put the $sign in here. Again, I have to drag to the right, but dragging to the left is unnecessary. I can do it. It's still going to give me 0. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I do have to drag to the left because we did that above. Sorry. So in the end, you should drag both ways. If you have to drag left at any time, you should drag left for everything. All right. Now we need to eliminate this -7. So I'm going to say it's equal to itself minus itself times where the 1 is in our pivot column. Go back in, put the $sign in on the multiple, and drag both ways. All right. So we've completed the pivot. Because we did change our variable on the left first thing, we don't have to worry about that. So, but make sure you do that because that helps you keep track of what everything is. So the solution at this point is to say, create only 12.5 units of product Y, create no units of X, because that's not pivoted, create no units of W, because that's not pivoted. Slack variable 2 is equal to 0, so we've actually used all the resources, even though it's a pivoted column. And slack variable 1 is 0, 2. So this solution of creating all 12.5 units of Y uses up all the resources. It gives us a profit of 187.5. But our Tableau is telling us it's not optimal because we have a negative here. So that's our new pivot column. The W is. And we need to minimize ratios. But now let's look what's happening here. I get a 12.5 divided by 0, so I can't pivot there. And the other row shows a 0. So the only choice I have is to pivot in the second row. But what's going to happen is, notice what's going to happen. Because of the 0 over here, when I add some multiple of this second row to the objective row, so that I can eliminate this -8, I'm going to add nothing. So I'm going to get a new decision, but it's going to be the same value of the objective function. It's going to be create only units of W instead of only units of Y. It's going to be the same. That's possible. Let's see that actually happens here. So again, we got to copy our Tableau. Paste the values. And perform the pivot. We have to change our label. W is our pivot column, so we're going to put W in our list, the pivot row. I made a mistake, so we're going to actually create y and w, but in the end we should see that the 187.5 will stay the same. All right, so I want to take pivot row here, this 8, I want to divide by 8, so let's say this is equal to the 8 by itself. Go in and change that number I'm dividing by, $8, so it's fixed. I gotta drag both ways. Now for y, there's already a 0 there, so we don't have to do anything. So all we have to do is eliminate this -8. So it's equal to the -8 it was, minus itself times where the 1 is. And again, if your Excel's doing this, you just look at the address. It's column F, row 33. So F 33. Then go back in. Again, for the multiple, or whatever you're multiplying or dividing by, that's the thing you want to $sign in. Drag both ways. And there's no more negatives in our objective row. So we are done. And the interpretation is to make 12.5 units of y, and look at that, make no units of w. So this is actually the same decision that the previous tableau told us. It's just that when you program a computer, it's going to do everything it has to do until it's told to stop. So this is just a case where even though the optimal decision was already made in a previous tableau, because of just how the numbers worked out and the geometry of how these inequalities were laid out, the algorithm still works. It just has to do an extra step, which doesn't really do much in the end. But it does tell us something else. So we're going to make 12.5 units of y. We're going to make no units of w. We're going to make no units of x because that's not pivoted. S1 is non-pivoted, so S1 is 0. So we've used up all of our resource 1. And S2 is not pivoted. We've used all of our resource 2, which we already knew from the previous tableau. So again, you have to follow the algorithm. It will get you there, but sometimes it's going to do more steps than maybe is necessary. However, if you kind of just choose your columns and rows kind of in a more arbitrary manner, you can get to the answer faster, but you can also get stuck in a loop. So that's kind of, beware of that. It's best to just pick your pivot columns to be the leftmost, pick your pivot row according to the ratios. If there's a tie, pick the top one, top row as your pivot row out of the tied rows for the pivot for that ratio, and then proceed in that manner.